Chief, hang on a second. It's about the checks off the informant fund.
There's an accounting for every one of those. I'd have to pull
They went into your personal account.
I'd have to look at the specific transactions. I don't carry every fund entry.
80 grand's over 2 years, Chief.
Karl R. Jacobson operated without oversight for 2 years as police chief in New Haven, Connecticut, controlling every dollar of the fund meant to pay informants. Not one person checked, until now.
I'm not going to stand here and guess at numbers without the records in front.
He was the chief of police in New Haven, Connecticut. Sitting in the room with him were 3 of his own assistant chiefs, and one of them had already pressed record on the phone in his pocket. By the end of that meeting on January 5th, Karl Jacobson would admit that he had a gambling problem. Within 9 weeks, the state of Connecticut would charge him with stealing $81,500 from a fund built to pay confidential informants, plus another $4,000 from a children's sports league. And behind it all sat a single number nobody in that room said out loud yet: $4.4 million. That is what he had wagered on 2 sports betting apps over roughly a year, on a salary of $180,000. Pay attention to the dollar amount in this case. Then think about how long it took anyone inside the department to notice. Leave your guess in the comments before we get there. Subscribe if you're new here. We break down how these schemes actually work, week after week, and this one is a masterclass in what happens when one man holds all the keys. Karl R. Jacobson was 55 years old at the time of his arrest. He had spent almost his entire adult life inside 2 police departments, and if you had asked anyone in either of them about him, even a month before this story broke, you would have heard some version of the same thing. Steady, reliable, nothing flashy. A cop who did the paperwork and moved up one rank at a time. He started his career in East Providence, Rhode Island, a small city on the east side of Narragansett Bay, with a population under 50,000 and a police department to match. He worked there for roughly 9 years. Patrol shifts in a used cruiser, traffic details on Wampanoag Trail, domestic calls in the triple-decker neighborhoods off Taunton Avenue. He learned the job the old way, on the pavement, in the middle of the night, in the kind of department where the chief knew every officer's first name. The pivot came when he crossed state lines. Jacobson joined the New Haven Police Department and over the next 15 years built the kind of internal resume that ends in a corner office on Union Avenue. Patrol shifts in the Hill and in Fair Haven, detective work, supervisory rotations, and crucially, assignments that gave him deep working knowledge of narcotics investigations and of exactly how confidential informant money moved through the department. He learned the ledger from the inside. He learned who signed what, who countersigned what, who never bothered to ask. By the time the chief's job opened up in 2022, Karl Jacobson was the natural internal candidate. City Hall wanted continuity. The rank and file wanted somebody who understood the department from the ground up. Mayor Justin Ellicker made the appointment. Salary, $180,000 a year, plus the pension credit he had been accruing across 2 states for close to a quarter century. The reaction inside the department was largely positive. Officers who had worked under him described him as approachable. Reporters at the New Haven Independent and the Yale Daily News described a chief who returned calls, who showed up at community meetings, who could speak intelligently about crime data and about the neighborhoods behind it. Ellicker himself would later describe the city's response to what came next as one of shock. He used the word betrayal. For the first 2 years, the job seemed to fit him. Homicides trended down. Officer-involved shootings stayed low by big city standards. He walked into press conferences with the calm of a man who had been in uniform since he was 22. He spoke slowly, deliberately. He was, by every outward measure, exactly the kind of chief a city like New Haven wanted at the podium. But somewhere in that second year, something started to shift. Not in public, not at the podium, not in the rank-and-file meetings. It shifted in the private space between him and his phone, in the late hours after his official calendar cleared, in a habit that the arrest warrant would later describe with the flat precision of forensic accounting. He was betting on sports. And he was betting on sports in a volume that no one in his life, personal or professional, appears to have understood. On paper, He was a 15-year veteran of the New Haven Police Department, a chief with a household name salary, a public servant with a spotless record. In the background, he was a man moving thousands of dollars at a time into 2 apps on his phone and losing. To understand how $81,500 can vanish from a police department without anyone noticing for 2 years, you have to understand what a Narcotic Enforcement Program Fund actually is. It is not an abstraction. It is not a line item. It is cash. In practice, the fund is a working cash account that a department maintains to pay confidential informants. When a detective in the narcotics unit works with a source, that source expects to be paid, sometimes in 20s, sometimes in hundreds, sometimes in denominations small enough to fit inside a handshake in the front seat of an unmarked car. The informant is the reason a case moves. The informant is the reason a warrant gets signed. The informant is the reason a middle-tier trafficker becomes a federal indictment. And the informant, above everything else, expects to be paid on schedule. In New Haven, the Narcotic Enforcement Program Fund had one custodian, and that custodian was the chief. By department practice, checks against the fund were signed by Jacobson. The internal reconciliation of those checks against actual informant payments was, by the department's own later admission, handled by Jacobson. There was no dual signature requirement in operational practice. There was no rotating oversight from the assistant chiefs. There was no monthly reconciliation reviewed by an outside auditor. There was one man, and there was one signature. That structure did not exist by accident. According to the acting chief, who would later take over the department, David Zanelli, the assistant chiefs had asked, repeatedly, over a span of years, to be given shared management authority over the informant fund. Zanelli has said publicly that Jacobson declined each of those requests, every time, in some cases with a shrug, in some cases with a lecture about how the fund had to stay narrow, tight, controlled, because informant confidentiality depended on the fewest possible hands touching the money. On the surface, that reasoning was defensible. Informant identities are among the most closely guarded pieces of information a police department holds. A leak from that fund could get a source killed. But the argument for tight control of informant identities does not require sole control of the money. 2 people can sign a check without either of them knowing the name of the person the money is going to. 2 people can reconcile a ledger without either of them ever meeting a source. The protection Jacobson invoked was a protection of information. What he actually held was a protection of the money itself. And because he held it alone, there was no one to notice when the checks stopped matching the payments. There was no one to notice when the fund's monthly cash flow started running dry. There was no one to notice for almost 2 years that the men and women who risked their lives to help narcotics detectives close cases were not, in fact, being paid. Because the chief said the fund was fine, and nobody was allowed to look. The arrest warrant affidavit lays out a period of alleged misappropriation running from January 1st, 2024 through January 5th, 2026. 2 years, almost to the day, and across those 2 years, according to prosecutors, $81,500 moved out of the Narcotic Enforcement Program Fund and into a place it was never supposed to go. The mechanism, on paper, was simple. A bank records review conducted by state investigators and the FBI found that checks drawn on the fund had been deposited directly into Karl Jacobson's personal checking account, not into an intermediate account, not into a fictional payee, straight in, his name on the endorsement line, his routing and account number underneath. The kind of paper trail that in any other context would be described as reckless, and in this context is more accurately described as the confidence of a man who did not believe anyone was ever going to check. What those deposits were funding is where the case turns from a routine embezzlement into something on the scale of a small hedge fund. Records subpoenaed from DraftKings and FanDuel, the 2 largest sports betting operators in the United States, show that between roughly early 2024 and early 2026, Karl Jacobson wagered $4,464,884.26. Say that number twice. 4.4 million on the salary of a public official earning $180,000 a year. His net loss across those wagers was $214,365.74. And to fund those wagers, according to Warrant records, he transferred $373,855 into the two apps across 1,366 separate deposits. 1,366. That is an average of nearly 4 transfers a day, every day, for a year. The cadence of the alleged theft matched the cadence of the gambling. Not one big withdrawal, not one obvious grab, a steady, patient drip. A check here for a few thousand, a check there for a few thousand more, enough to keep the personal account solvent, enough to keep the wagers moving, enough to plug the losses that a $200,000 net drop implies when you factor in the money that was moving in both directions. And then, in December of 2025, something shifted. The Informant Fund alone was not enough. The last 2 checks Jacobson allegedly took, on December 23rd and December 24th, did not come from the Narcotic Enforcement Program Fund at all. They came from the New Haven Police Activity League, the PAL, a youth sports nonprofit funded in part by donations from the community and in part by voluntary payroll deductions from New Haven police officers themselves. A program that ran youth basketball leagues, boxing programs, summer camps for kids in neighborhoods where the alternative was the street corner. 2 checks, $4,000. 2 days. December 23rd, December 24th. The day before Christmas Eve and Christmas Eve itself. He knew what the money was for. He knew where it came from. He knew that some of it had been deducted, dollar by dollar, from the paychecks of officers under his command. He signed anyway. The signs, in hindsight, were everywhere. The lifestyle of a man losing over $200,000 a year to sports betting does not stay perfectly hidden. Late-night phone use, constant checking of scores, the specific, distinctive frown of a man watching a fourth-quarter drive turn against a bet. But he was the chief. Nobody in the department watched the chief the way the chief watched them, and nobody looked at the fund because they were not allowed to. The entire case turns on one sergeant. The official record does not name him publicly. He was, at the time of the report, assigned to the intelligence unit of the New Haven Police Department, a plainclothes assignment that lives in the same building as narcotics and shares a lot of the same rhythms. He noticed something that a person outside the building would never have noticed. He noticed that the informants had not been paid. In narcotics work, that is the kind of gap that lights up like a warning flare. Informants are, by definition, people who are taking a serious personal risk to help police close a case. They are not doing it out of civic duty. They are doing it because the department pays them, and because the department has, historically, always paid them on time. When those payments stop, the whole engine stops with them. Sources stop returning calls. Detectives lose leverage. Ongoing investigations start to leak air. And a sergeant who spends his days inside that ecosystem is going to feel it before anyone in a corner office ever does. According to the reporting that came out after the arrest, by early December 2025, informants had not been paid for the month of November. By late December, they had not been paid for December either. 2 months. In a program where a delay of 2 weeks is enough to raise eyebrows. On December 23, 2025, that sergeant walked over to then Assistant Chief David Zanelli and told him what he was seeing. Zanelli did what a competent supervisor does. He did not confront. He did not tip his hand. He listened. And then he started making his own quiet inquiries. He pulled at the thread. He looked at when checks had been drawn on the fund. He looked at how much had gone out. He looked at when informants had last been marked as paid inside the department's own records. And what he found did not match. The checks were leaving the fund. The informants were not receiving the money. Somewhere between the signature and the street, something was diverting it. Over the next 12 days, Zanelli quietly briefed 2 other assistant chiefs. Together, the 3 of them made a decision that would define the rest of the case. They were not going to send the chief a memo. They were not going to file a report through internal affairs and let it work its way up. They were going to walk into his office, close the door, and ask him directly. And they were going to make sure that when they did, there was a record of what he said. Because the man they were about to confront controlled the department. He controlled the recordings, the evidence room, the personnel files, and the informant fund itself. If they were going to catch him admitting anything, they were going to have to do it in a way that could not be edited or lost. On January 5, 2026, 3 assistant chiefs walked into Karl Jacobson's office. David Zanelli was one of them. In his pocket, on silent, his department-issued phone was already recording. Still with me? Good. Because the next part of this case is the part where a police chief who controlled every recording in his building gets caught on a recording of his own. If you appreciate the way these cases actually break, subscribe. We cover accountability stories that most channels won't touch, every single week. What the investigation eventually assembled around that January 5th meeting is a case built in 3 layers, and each layer is stronger than the one before it. The first layer is documentary. Investigators, working alongside the FBI's forensic accountants, pulled the checks drawn against the Narcotic Enforcement Program Fund for the 24-month window from January 1st, 2024 through January 5th, 2026. Then they pulled Karl Jacobson's personal checking account statements for the same period, and they laid them side by side. Check number, date, amount, endorsement, deposit. The paper matched. The checks that should have gone to informants had, in fact, been endorsed by Jacobson and deposited into his own account. $81,500, moved one check at a time, over 2 years. The second layer is the December 23rd and December 24th, PAL fund checks. $4,000 total, drawn on a youth sports account partially funded by voluntary payroll deductions from officers he supervised, deposited into the same personal account. The third layer is the sports betting. And this is where the case stops being about a police chief with a gambling problem and starts being about the mathematical impossibility of what he was doing. Records from DraftKings and FanDuel showed that in the same rough time window, Jacobson had wagered $4,464,884.26. His net loss was $214,365.74. And to feed those wagers, he had transferred $373,855 into the 2 apps across 1,366 separate deposits. Investigators did what they always do with numbers like those. They compared. His annual gross salary was $180,000. His annual net after federal, state, Social Security, Medicare, and pension contributions was, by any reasonable estimate, somewhere in the low 6 figures. There was no plausible universe in which a man taking home that amount, with a mortgage and normal living expenses, could sustain $373,000 in outbound app transfers over roughly 12 months without an external source of cash. The external source of cash was sitting right there. It was the informant fund. It was the PAL fund. It was the money he had spent his entire career being trusted to safeguard. The forensic accountants ran the numbers. The number lined up. The prosecutors read the number. And on February 20th, 2026, the state of Connecticut walked the arrest warrant to a judge. Back up 7 weeks. Because before there was a warrant, before there was an indictment, before there was a bank of forensic accountants reconciling 24 months of check registers, there was a single room, and there were 3 men in that room, and there was a phone that was already recording. The meeting on January 5th, 2026 was arranged without warning. Zanelli and 2 other assistant chiefs asked to speak with the chief. The tone, by all accounts, was calm. They sat. They closed the door. They asked him about the informant fund. What happened next has become one of the most important pieces of the case, because David Zanelli, sitting across from his boss, had already made the decision to press the record button on his department-issued phone before he walked in. He recorded the conversation. What that recording captured, in Zanelli's later account, was not a denial. It was not a demand for a lawyer. It was not an attempt to invoke garrity or to shut the meeting down. It was, according to reporting on the affidavit, an admission. Jacobson conceded that he had a problem with gambling. He said he was seeking help. Pressed on how much he had taken from the fund, he initially told them $10,000. Assistant Chief Zanelli: Karl, we have questions about the NEP fund. Jacobson: All right, ask them. Zanelli: The informants haven't been paid in November. They haven't been paid in December. Where did the money go? Jacobson: I've spent too much on gambling. I know. I'm getting help. Zanelli: How much, Karl? Jacobson: Around $10,000. I'll pay it back. $10,000 was, in retrospect, not close. It was not close on the same order of magnitude. The actual figure, once the FBI and state investigators finished the forensic comparison, was over 8 times that. $81,500 from the Narcotic Enforcement Program Fund, another $4,000 from the PAL, $85,500 all in. But the admission on that recording, however incomplete, was enough. It was enough to turn a suspicion into a case. It was enough to give the state's attorney the probable cause needed to secure a warrant for the bank records that would ultimately do the rest of the work. Jacobson did not leave that office and go back to his job. He did not resume command of the department. Hours later, on the same day, January 5, 2026, he abruptly retired. It happened fast enough that when Mayor Justin Elliker walked out to hold a press conference that afternoon to announce the situation to the city, the chief was already, officially, no longer the chief. He walked out of 1 Union Avenue for the last time as chief before the sun went down. On February 20th, 2026, Karl R. Jacobson turned himself in at the State Police Troop E barracks in Montville, Connecticut, a low brick building on Route 82 that handles state police coverage for the southeastern corner of the state. He was booked. He was fingerprinted. He posted a court-set bond of $150,000 and was released the same day. The charges were 2 counts of larceny in the first degree by defrauding a public community in violation of Connecticut General Statutes, Section 53A, 122A, 3. 1 count for the Narcotic Enforcement Program Fund. 1 count for the New Haven Police Activity League Fund. Each count is a Class B felony under Connecticut law, carrying a maximum exposure of up to 20 years in prison, and each carries the additional statutory framing that the theft was from a public community, an aggravating factor that reflects the specific betrayal of taking from a government fund rather than from a private victim. The case was assigned out of the New Britain Judicial District rather than the New Haven Judicial District, a routine but deliberate step taken to avoid any conflict of interest, given that Jacobson had spent 15 years working with the prosecutors, judges, and courthouse staff in the New Haven building. State's Attorney Christian M. Watson was assigned to oversee the prosecution. The underlying investigation was led by the Connecticut State Police under the authority of Chief State's Attorney Patrick J. Griffin. On April 17, 2026, Karl Jacobson appeared in court in New Britain and, through his defense attorney Gregory Caratelli, entered a plea of not guilty to both counts. Outside the courthouse, in front of a small bank of local reporters, he offered a public statement. He apologized to Mayor Elliker. He apologized to the city of New Haven. He apologized to the officers who had served under him, and he attributed his conduct, in his own words, to online gambling. His defense attorney, Caratelli, offered the standard and legally necessary reminders. An arrest is not proof of guilt. His client had not yet received discovery from the state. The allegations, however documented, would be tested through the ordinary process of a criminal trial. That process, as of this writing, is still unfolding. No verdict has been reached. No sentence has been imposed. Prosecutors have publicly indicated that additional charges remain possible. The bank records continue to be analyzed, and if further diversions from the fund are identified, further counts may follow. What is not pending, and what does not require a jury to establish, is the institutional damage. The Narcotic Enforcement Program Fund now operates under shared oversight, exactly the way David Zanelli and the other assistant chiefs had asked for it to operate for years. Multiple signatures are now required on checks drawn against the fund. Independent reconciliation happens on a fixed schedule. The kind of control that Jacobson had insisted was necessary to protect informant confidentiality has been rewritten to protect the money without compromising the identities. It turns out those two things were never in tension. They only appeared to be when one man had a reason to keep everyone else out. The New Haven Police Activity League continues to operate. The $4,000 taken on December 23rd and December 24 has, by public reporting, been backfilled by donations. The youth basketball leagues still play, the summer camps still run, but the officers who agreed, voluntarily, to have money taken from their own paychecks to support a program for kids in their city now do so knowing that at least once that money was allegedly taken by the chief and lost to a betting app. Mayor Justin Ellicker has said, on the record, that the reaction of the city was one of shock. He used the word betrayal. He praised Zanelli, who has been serving as acting chief, for having the discipline to press record before walking into that January 5th meeting. Because the entire case, and everything the state has been able to build on top of it, rests on what happened in that room. A police chief who spent his career overseeing the recording of others was, in the end, caught by the quiet click of a phone in an assistant chief's pocket. He controlled the informants. He controlled the fund. He controlled the recordings the department made of everyone else. And the same evidence-gathering discipline he had built the New Haven Police Department to practice was, in the end, the discipline that ended his career. The case is pending. The presumption of innocence remains. But the number sits on the record, unchallenged and unexplained. $4.4 million wagered on 2 apps by a man earning $180,000 a year. And somewhere in the gap between those two numbers sat a fund that was supposed to pay informants and did not. This case is still unfolding. But the next case on your screen right now went all the way to sentencing, and what the judge said at the podium is the kind of thing you don't forget. Click it now.